So do you want to go to Disneyland Paris or?
I really meant it when I said I wasn't planning to hit up another Disney park anytime soon, especially after our California trip in 2022 and bank account statements thereafter. But things changed in April of 2023. Paris's park was turning 30, I was turning 30, all my friends were off land, and my sister was like, this is a nice coincidence. It's only going to happen once. While we can, why don't we go? And we did, and it was nice and fun and good. And of course, as most of you have come to expect, I found myself overthinking the situation, musing on how I got there, my history with the park, what was going down then compared to now. So naturally, I was like, well, that could be another video. Oh yes, another midlife Disney adult crisis, how interesting. Perhaps it's a sign of what I grew up on, brought forward by going back to a place that represents it so clearly, and in a time where things aren't necessarily going peachy keen for an 100-year-old brand. Taking all of that into account, it's hard not to think of what happened to bring this here, while also thinking on about the future. Yeah, it's gonna be one of those. Sorry.
Time to doom.
What? The history of my experience here goes back a lot further than with California. Paris was my first Disney park. We were there pretty much as the height of the Renaissance was about to crest on a couple of muted releases, and Hercules was the big noise they were gassing up, rightly so. Already gabbed about that plenty in the past, you know, before I fell off. At the time, you'd be forgiven for thinking everything was business as usual, but of course what we didn't, and at that age couldn't have known, was the chaos the park was born into. Paris was not a great success. It was an extremely difficult project, met with hostility both within and without the straining Disney company at the time, and the situation has been well documented, officially and unofficially. Obviously, I didn't notice any of that back then. I was too busy enjoying 90s youth, under the impression everything was just fine, and not aware that my parents were about to get bowled over by Buzz. Carrying the ghost of that visit with me is one thing. Stepping back into a space that felt, even with so many changes, almost exactly the same way it felt 20 years ago is truly another. The look, the size, the texture of it all, it even smells the same. But the feeling was even weirder given I was in the American parks only a few months before. In fact, my visits to both California and Florida were a little closer than I realized. I misspoke in the last video. I did start the channel in 2008, but it was 2010 when I went to Cali the first time. Tiana really should have tipped me off. And having been to both so much sooner made this return much more disorientating. Things not exactly where you expect, stuff missing from places you'd think they'd be, and experiencing the park this way, in this order, kind of made me realize something I'd never thought on before. Here's what visiting 2 international Disney parks in under a year revealed. It's not just a regional experience you're getting, but a historical one. The original Disneyland was built in the 50s, and it feels, even with its many changes, like a 50s park. Everything's built on a particular scale. The style and shape of it is very squared off and succinct, and the legacy attractions all reek of their 50s origins. It's as much a museum as a working park. Walt Disney World was built in the 70s, and it feels like the 70s. Very big on futurism, huge focus on international travel and exotic locations, and the colours are a bit space-age yellow and grey as the 80s infrastructure starts to fold in. So what does a park from the 90s offer? A full 90s experience. Big, loud set pieces, extremely vaporwave color choices, enormous dioramas, and attempts at external leisure activities that really put the theme in theme park. Even the music still sounds like it's from a 90s adventure game. I can't use these things together. Obviously, a part of me feeling that is having been here at the tail end of the decade. But even then, the contrast with both Florida and California so recently in my lifetime really put it all into perspective. I'd wager if you went to the Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Tokyo parks, they too would feel most like the eras they were built in. Just look at what's happening on the Pirates ride in Shanghai, built in the late 2010s. They got everything. And everyone.
Fish people.
This isn't to say that you don't feel the impact of current leadership. When we visited California, it was entirely obvious that it was a victim to the practices of then head of Disney Bob Chapek, an interim manager after Disney CEO Bob Iger left at the break of the pandemic, and then came back. Still crazy to think about, still a lot to say there. But what became blindingly obvious was that, for all the years that have passed and the changes still being made, Paris remains a monument to its particular group of designers and the person above them all, Michael Eisner.
Euro Disneyland, officiellement ouvert.
Quick history lesson. After Walt's death, leadership at Disney was pretty abysmal. His son-in-law couldn't manage it, neither could the CEOs that followed. And I can tell you firsthand from a conversation with Richard Williams that the employees were at each other's throats. It was Walt's nephew Roy who finally stepped in and organised a complete turnaround by instating Hollywood mogul Michael Eisner, supported by Frank Wells and Jeffrey Katzenberg. I don't think it's a secret that I'm a bit of an Eisner apologist. He was the last of the crazy creative execs, someone who clearly loved the movie business as much as the, business. And while the second half of his career was a lot of misses, the first was a lot of hits that came from his desire to put some energy into the company, get it to start listening to what the people wanted, and work with current talents who had an interest in entertainment, not just the 12 principles. It's partly thanks to him that the Disney Renaissance got kickstarted, and while he was never very good at presenting to camera, he came across as pretty real. I don't know what I'd do here either.
Ran Floridian Reed.
Okay, who else can we get?
But I'm not naive enough to put all the credit at his feet alone. And neither was he, because he knew the real heroes carrying out these edicts were the Imagineers he let fly, including head of Paris's development division, Tony Baxter, an old-school Walt Disney fan and overall good egg. His direction for the park reflected a true love for the material, for the things Walt himself adored. Not just animation, but cinematic adventure, the turn of the century, Jules Verne and the art of park building, and his direction saw the park become what is still one of the best looking of the bunch. His genius was in the decision to make it fully explorable, making it so much more than a facade and having every nook and cranny contain something a guest could be a part of. If you can see it, you can go there, and that philosophy has aged extremely well. The place is enormous, always places to rest, always places to be, and the lands are as interactive as they are gorgeous to look at. As with anything, it's a combination of people with big ideas, coloured by the time they were brought up in, that brings us a park as interesting in isolation from the big picture, and what was good about it then is still good now. This is the best Fantasyland, hands down, because it's an actual land. A bubbling brook runs underneath the pavement. The Teacups ride has this fantastic awning. Small World was under refurbishment, but the exterior is still as grand as I remembered, more dedicated to colour. Bit disturbing to walk into an exact replica of Toad's ride to find a chippy, but that's Europe for you, baby. We did it to Spain. We did it everywhere. Storybook Brook in California is pretty twee, right? A poor cast member having to guide the boats with this really bland commentary purely because the boats have to be controlled. But in Paris, no, wrong. Demons. We've got Peter and the Wolf, Aladdin, Chernabog on Bald Mountain. It's a boys' ride. Biggest surprise was when Oz showed up, and realising the music they picked was from that one Disney movie, which, you know, you saw the video, you know how I feel about that. Frontierland feels like it occupies the largest park space. No Tom Sawyer's Island, because that space is occupied by Big Chunder. And the mainland for me hosts maybe my favourite iteration of Disney's most enduring ride. There's a big cult around the Haunted Mansion in America, so it tends to be incredibly busy almost all the time, a big e-ticket event you have to make time for. But Paris doesn't quite have the same reverence, evident by the fact that I don't think there was a wait time above 25 minutes for pretty much my entire stay. Not gonna lie, it's a bit eerie to get on the ride before park closing, with about as many people as a Benoit Blanc mystery, especially when the lights are way dimmer than I'm used to, rendering the majority of my footage useless. I was in the queue for Haunted Mansion and I get that it was hot and busy and it was working fine, but overhearing the ride operator's conversation about his headshots, I don't know, not exactly playing the game. But Phantom Manor, I'm telling you, they're committed. A little girl in front of us screamed because some guy was just hiding in the shadows. And before the ride got going, I saw some fella's hand just appear above the buggy, scaring the life out of my sis. That's what you get. Discoveryland is another beautiful location. Not the largest or most dense Tomorrowland by any means. I think Florida holds that record. But the Jules Verne flavour makes it a treat to experience. The idea was to solve the Tomorrowland problem, that whatever you design will eventually be out of date. Therefore leaning into a timeless style representing a zest for creation and progress that has never gone away. I find the Nautilus still being there a bit of a personal victory, although it was closed at the time and I hear they've since made it worse. This is an easy fix, guys. Just hire me to be James Mason and you're done. That's it. $1 million ticket increase. That seal was the greatest actor I ever worked with. I loved that seal. Better than Judy. No, I joke, obviously. I can't even step to Harry Enfield on this one.
Mr. McGregor, take her up to 8, eh?
You should know, actually. I don't do fast rides. I don't know if I've admitted to that yet. It's kind of why Disney is my one go-to if I ever go. I just can't do them. It's like a stomach feeling. It's bad, man. I couldn't do the Barnstormer. And that's tiny. But my sister's cool with them, so I just get the deets off whatever's great about Space Mountain from her.
I'm sat next to a very nice Italian family, and the man next to me spent the entire ride going, "Mamma mia!"
Due to the rough history though, there's still a few gaps I don't think have been dealt with properly. Adventureland has an amazing sense of scale, with Skull Rock, Hook Ship, and a banging version of pirates, but that's sort of all it's got, missing a couple of meatier staples. It's really noticeable there's no Jungle Cruise, and I sort of get it. In terms of language, it's a bit of a logistical nightmare. I remember back in the day it was mostly French spoken on property, though on this revisit it now seems to be a solid split between French and English, with a little Spanish and German thrown in on occasion. I've known a couple people personally who've worked the park, so I imagine it's shifted more and more towards catering to its neighbours as time goes on. Funny story actually, my buddy was a friend of Woody's, and he was up to become a friend of Spider-Man's, but he kinda bulked out. So he goes to the dressing lady and she looks at him and she goes, "You are going to be Spider-Man's friend?" And he says, "Yeah," and she shakes her head and goes, "Not anymore." Anyway, it's also got a bunch of closed off areas now. I don't know if the arcade in Videopolis is ever opening back up. Honestly, I don't know if Videopolis is ever getting used properly again. Back in the day, it played old Mickey cartoons and hosted some killer stage shows like the Chinese acrobatics during the release of Mulan. Now it hosts nothing except burgers and the new Mickey tunes, which I really love, but yeah, it would be nice for this to not feel like a wasted spot, you know? Like a tomb. Pizza Planet's gone. A place I remember very vividly, but maybe for the best. Probably were forced to shut down by the health department, all a bit risky rat. Maybe more can be done now. For the longest time, it was partially owned by the French government, who have since sold it back to Disney, and as a result, they're able to reach in and make further developments, which it sort of needs given the absolute state of its second gate. When we spoke to Kevin at D23, he was explaining how much he'd enjoyed finally seeing the Paris park in person, but when asked about studios, I hope this is okay to share. Oh, it's terrible, burn it all down, start over. Can't disagree. The Studios park is pretty infamous as a monument to Eisner's failures at the end of the Renaissance era, and there's no hiding the fact that people were not getting on at this point. With the death of his fellow CEO and friend Frank Wells, Eisner found himself making bad decisions that led to the development of California Adventure, a widely criticized and mocked second park in Cali that failed to establish any great theme or reason to exist, with a bunch of rides nobody really liked. But compared to the Paris Studios park, that was utopia. This is kinda bad. The park had even less on opening. A big walk-around studio warehouse, a lobby with some courtyards and prop buildings and a tour, and that's it. Mostly there to compete with Universal, who had all of that kind of sussed. So the additional areas that have arrived since really have made quite the difference. There's a greater Pixar presence with a fairly inspired Toy Story zone, and a very impressive Ratatouille area, with the funniest ride cars in the park and a full-blown restaurant where I assume you get served by Remy.
Would you care for a rat?
There's the new Avengers campus they've retrofitted from its California counterpart, which is the kind of space I think this has badly been in need of. It's far from being as cohesive. I think the shape of Cali's campus makes for a more communal space, where everything connects and guests can take part from any angle, with extra shows and the better e-ticket conversion. But the Paris one has better food, as you might have hoped. Yeah, so not a big improvement. But there were some details I really liked. A phenomenal job done of providing Peggy Carter's for real office, and even a unique Spidey show. Sure, they don't launch an animatronic, but having him wailing on the tracksuit mafia is a little more my speed anyway. Less chance of this. The Avengers theming now carries over to the nearby New York hotel. Actually quite a good fit that makes the effort to highlight the behind-the-scenes art of the films, and even the comics themselves, which feels very in keeping with French sensibilities, and again highlighting an effort to clean up the incredibly 90s themed living quarters in the downtown Disney district. Try saying that 5 times 5. I mean, this is where the ghost of that 90s vibe can be felt the most. So many huge statements being made, particularly concerning the French's love of the Wild West, which seems to have one foot in the grave at the moment. The Buffalo Bill show they used to have now just an empty shell. Slightly humbling. In spite of that, I was actually pleased to see how much of that was still preserved. Long faded memories of walking into a Wild West town out of nowhere that I now understand was just over the road. I walked into the centre of it again and went, my god, it's still here. It's a for real Wild West town. And almost on cue, a French cowboy walked out of a door and went, howdy. That's weird, man. He was nice though. It was an interesting revisit of what was clearly a park thinking over its cultural identity. Eisner's presence is very much still here, built on the principles of his tenure, and the people he trusted to get it right. And I think it's made for a slice of the 90s we can better understand with so much hindsight. It was the decade that set so much of my background and just about everyone else my age. And it was interesting to see not just how much things had changed, but how much was still building off of the great strides made in that particular time. Even with corrections that, I don't know, might have been better left uncorrected.
Oh my god! No. This is the worst day of his life! Oh my god! God! He's just dead.
What was equally interesting, though, was feeling the parallel effects on another park a lot closer to my neck of the woods. With a taste for themed entertainment dominating the period, a lot of other people got into the act all across the world, and all undergoing a particularly drastic change in what was sort of a theme park arms race. Chesington Zoo had made the change into the world of adventures, and boasted much larger attractions and entertainment, transformed into what was, as a kid, my theme park of choice. As the taste for that waned, however, it took a step back and decided to concentrate purely on its animals, creating larger enclosures as it took direction from Disney's Animal Kingdom. They'd never reached the budget and size of that, of course, but it wasn't a bad attempt, and visiting it today, you can see it's gone all in on that angle. Once again, though, it's hard not to feel the ghost of what it was. New attractions have been tailored to better fit that vision, but old ones feel lost in the mix, the rides not holding up to what they used to be, and the park gutting a lot of what they couldn't maintain. Everyone could rival Disney's success with the money they acquired in the greed is good era of the 80s, but nobody had their means to continue its upkeep. With changing times and technology seeing a lot of these places do only fairly well by comparison, and becoming more niche in their offerings. Legoland and Chesington went all in with their child-friendly appeal, while Thorpe Park and Alton Towers ditched the all-audience aspects to cater purely to thrill-seekers, maybe specifically decided on the moment they had a Spider-Man stunt show and Mary Jane sat down to sing about how she felt a bit sad. Everyone's kind of figured out their place, and I'm not sure how many people's hearts are really in competing against the big boys anymore. Other Merlin-owned enterprises are scaling to provide similar experiences. A few drama school friends of mine were struggling to find work back home and found an opportunity down at Warwick Castle, playing nights in the immersive shows they were putting on, a bit like the ones we saw in Vegas. Just as wild, but less ab windows. Crazy stuff they're doing out here. The history might be a bit suspect, but the work is undeniable, pulling off moves that had me quite afeared for their safety. There were equal attempts to beef up their other offerings, including what I have to admit was a pretty show-stopping bird event, with a bunch of trainers who really knew their stuff. Another fun story, actually. My grandfather on my mother's side was a falconer, who used to give school talks about his job. Years later, he takes us on a personal tour at Warwick with one of the trainers so we could handle them, and gets talking to the trainer about how he got into the business. The answer? Watching my granddad's talk. Small world. A heritage site will always have historical value, and keep finding ways to draw people in, especially as what we know of history continues to develop and evolve. But I wonder how much longer the themed entertainment business really has left for anyone who isn't involved with a major movie studio. There was life before these things, there'll be life after. Maybe. But it's that question of what the next big thing is. What do people want? You just assumed 20 years ago this would last forever, and now it feels like, yeah, but why though? Eisner himself is out of the game, enjoying his time as the manager of Portsmouth, perhaps inspiration for these boys. But he ushered in retrospect, what was one of the more exciting eras of showbiz, even taking risks well into its failure. And I don't know if that's ever going to be true again. I don't think I can say Disney is ready for that right now. There's all sorts of news about how it's changing or going to change, or about how it's just hanging on by a thread, and I can't tell you what's true and what's not. I don't know if people are outgrowing what it has to offer indefinitely, but they're certainly still returning to the site of something they remember being good once, right? I mean, I'm making this video, so... It's been a year of going back in time for me in general. After the easing of the pandemic, I was finally able to visit my friends, people I hadn't seen for 4 years, some of them longer, and falling back into familiar patterns and rhythms as if no time had passed at all, even picking up some new ones.
Mess me up to it.
In what way?
I don't know, just destroy me.
It was real nice, remembering I have people I can count on and who are much funnier than me. Maybe too funny, who are all managing well for themselves, and naturally, it all has me thinking about what's next for me too. I made it this far, building off the back of all the things I enjoyed and the people who got me there, but at some point I need to put in more of the work myself, take a risk, start adding to the pile rather than rolling in what's left. It's what got this place here once upon a time in the distant past, so why not me? What's stopping me too?
Where are we going?
Because it's champagne.
Oh.
Cheers. Or as they say here, salut.
Dad, can I have a towel for my eyes?
The work never stops.